.50 caliber machine guns on each of the compound's 4 guard towers spit a steady stream of tracer fire into the darkness. The original gunners are all dead, eliminated with chilling precision by unseen snipers in the opening seconds of the assault. Now panic takes hold. Cartel fighters stumble over their fallen comrades, clawing their way to the still smoking machine guns. But it's hopeless. They're hunting ghosts. For the American operators lurking in the shadows, this isn't a capture mission, this is an operation to wipe out senior cartel leadership. Above the relentless thunder of heavy machine guns, a deafening roar cuts through the night. A series of explosions rip through the compound as a pair of 2 Apache gunships rip across the sky, turning their cannons back onto the cartel members in the compound below. This is a glimpse at what an American war against the drug cartels would look like. We'll explain why on today's episode of The Infographic Show, the American military's plan to destroy the cartel terrorists. Using military action against drug cartels is not a new idea. It's been floated by the White House since even before the Reagan years. Both Democrat and Republican administrators have often considered unleashing the might of America's military upon the drug cartels, and yet to date none have. But why? And just how likely is it that the U.S. would go to war with the cartels? A military operation we're calling Tactical Assault on Cartel Organizations, or TACO. For years, the U.S. has flirted with the idea of using military force against Mexican cartels. But recently, the driving force isn't just crime, it's a crisis. Fentanyl, the deadly synthetic opioid, has ignited an epidemic, with overdose deaths skyrocketing since 2014. Back then, the drug was linked to 10,000 deaths. By 2023, that number had exploded to 100,000, with fentanyl responsible for as much as 70% of them. America's chief geopolitical rival might be responsible for this massive uptick in deaths. Up until 2019, China was the world's largest producer of fentanyl, until U.S. diplomatic pressure forced Beijing to officially ban its production. But behind the scenes, China played a different game. While feigning ignorance, China remained the top supplier of fentanyl to drug manufacturers who laced their products with it to maximize addiction. The allegations were never proven, but within the defense community, one theory remains persistent. China knowingly allowed the fentanyl trade to flourish as a form of asymmetric warfare, designed to weaken the United States from within. Unlike Western nations, China doesn't see war as beginning with the first shot fired. Where the West waits for kinetic action, China believes war begins long before, through economic, political, and societal destabilization. This is why China has historically engaged in many gray zone activities against the U.S. and its neighbors in the Pacific. Undermining America with fentanyl was likely one of these activities. For some nationalist Chinese, there was a fitting irony to the situation, as the West had once flooded China with opium in order to disrupt its society and make it easily subjugated politically by Western powers. Despite China banning production of fentanyl in 2019, the nation still remains the largest supplier of fentanyl precursors, with India coming a close second. These two nations together make up the majority of fentanyl supply that manages to make its way inside of the U.S. Short of a full-scale shooting war, the U.S. is limited to diplomatic pressure against both nations, but the cartel are a different matter altogether. The cartels present a clear military target to destroy in hopes of disrupting the drug trade. But before we get to destroying cartels and the consequences, can a president even authorize this kind of military action? American presidents have the authority to deploy military force without congressional approval, but only up to a point. This allows for swift responses to threats without getting bogged down in congressional gridlock. However, a prolonged campaign against the cartels would require full congressional approval. And that's where things get politically dicey. Border states, the ones closest to the fight, may be the least willing to support all-out war. After all, if the U.S. takes the fight to the cartels, those states will be first in the firing line when the cartels strike back. What makes things easier for a president is a clear justification and legislative wiggle room. If a war against the cartels is framed as a retaliation for an attack on Americans, the political path becomes much smoother. One way to do this is by labeling cartels as terrorist organizations. This wouldn't just clear a path for military action, it would transform law enforcement's fight against the cartels. With expanded legal authority and access to greater resources, agencies could strike harder and faster, crippling cartel operations both at home and abroad. As for the possibility of a cartel attack on the U.S., the threat isn't just hypothetical. American counter-narcotics intelligence has long reported that cartels have considered using weaponized drones against U.S. Border Patrol agents. Due to a significantly increased security posture along the border, cartels are finding it more difficult to smuggle drugs and humans into the U.S. Thus, they have floated the idea of using drones to target Border Patrol personnel. If such an attack were to happen, the president would have nearly all the political support necessary to retaliate against cartels. It also would allow them to invoke the United Nations Article 51, which includes provisions for a nation to use military force in self-defense. Mexico remains the wild card in this scenario, but even without Mexico's approval, the U.S. could still take action against the cartel. Title 50 of the U.S. Code of Law allows for a president to order military action against a priority target inside a foreign country, even if that country has not been consulted or coordinated with. The last time Title 50 was invoked, it authorized Operation Neptune Spear, the mission that sent elite U.S. Navy SEALs deep into Pakistani airspace to eliminate Osama bin Laden. Then there's the kinetic option that doesn't place boots on the ground. Instead, it relies on a weapon the U.S. has mastered: drones and airstrikes. America's no stranger to using drone strikes in order to express a difference of opinion with foreign terrorist leaders. In early 2020, a drone strike killed Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps leader, Qasem Soleimani, the man responsible for overseeing Iran's vast network of terrorist allies in the Middle East. The problem with this strategy is that while drone strikes are highly effective at eliminating high-value targets with minimal collateral damage, they're unlikely to be enough. Cartels are a persistent and deeply entrenched threat. Even a sustained high-volume drone and airstrike campaign wouldn't be enough to break them. They've already proven their resilience, rapidly replacing key leadership after arrests. Meanwhile, the U.S. and Mexico parade their latest cartel catch as a victory in the war on drugs. Yet the flow of narcotics never stops, not even for a second. Using drones and airstrikes also means the inevitable loss of very valuable intelligence on the ground. In Iraq and Afghanistan, ground raids were preferred when possible in order to collect critical intelligence, which led to the unraveling of terror groups like Al-Qaeda. Eliminating the cartel would require the same level of engagement. And after 2 decades of fighting an asymmetrical war in the Middle East, there is no nation on earth better prepared for the job than the United States military. That still doesn't mean it would be a cakewalk, as we're about to learn, though. With ground forces as the best option, the first thing that Washington should do is get Mexican approval and a status of forces agreement. These agreements help protect any American soldiers accidentally left behind or captured from prosecution by a host nation. It would also pave the way for better cooperation on the ground. At the moment, Mexico seems unlikely to grant this permission, as Mexico's president has seen the White House's call for military action against the cartels as a violation of its sovereignty. But in the future, an agreement may be reached, and until then, there's another weapon that can be deployed against the cartels: the 7th Special Forces Group. Stationed in Florida, the 7th SFG operates in 32 countries across Central and South America. Its soldiers are not only highly trained, but also fluent in local languages and deeply familiar with regional customs. For decades, the 7th SFG has been the go-to force for U.S. counter-narcotics operations throughout the region. The 7th SFG has embedded itself with host nation militaries to help train them and form elite counter-narco units. Rather than go out into the field and pull the trigger themselves, they teach their hosts how to do it instead. The U.S. could deploy the 7th to Mexico and ramp up military support in the form of ammunition and equipment, letting Mexican military forces take the lead. The U.S. could also provide air support and intelligence gathering assistance to the Mexican military. This is likely the way Mexico would prefer it, as it would not be seen as a violation of its sovereign territory by locals. But if the White House was insistent on taking action itself, there's various tools it would use, and we're already seeing some of them move into position. First, any military action against the cartels would require a massive strengthening of the border security beforehand. Under fire, the cartels would retaliate, and without a fortified border, that violence wouldn't stay confined to the south. There are already over 500 Marine engineers on the border to repair and strengthen infrastructure and barricades. In the wake of a full-blown war against the cartels, we would expect to see many more similar engineering units begin construction on fortifications and barricades. National Guard forces would also be deployed to reinforce Border Patrol agents along the nearly 2,000-mile border. Their presence wouldn't just add manpower, it would bring critical air surveillance assets, allowing for real-time monitoring and rapid response to any cartel retaliation attempts. Next, the U.S. would need to establish a massive logistical presence along the border to sustain long-term operations. With numerous military bases spread across the southern U.S., American forces would have deep operational reach into Mexico. Combat and surveillance aircraft could maintain extended loiter times, providing persistent coverage over the northern half of the country. However, resupply of forces deployed into Mexico itself would require pre-staging of everything from medicine to ammunition and food. This is where cooperation agreements with Mexico would be critical. Without secure land routes into Mexico, the U.S. could be forced to rely solely on air operations for resupply, which would be a risky gamble. Cartels have grown increasingly sophisticated, and their expanding arsenal could pose a serious threat to transport aircraft operating in contested airspace. Long before the hostilities begin, though, U.S. surveillance assets would begin sniffing out intelligence on the cartels, especially to build out patterns of life, which are crucial in targeting. This intelligence can include intercepted phone calls, physical tracking of cartel and cartel forces' movements, and human intelligence on the ground in the form of cooperative locals. Here, we are actually seeing the U.S. already laying the groundwork. For what might be the first time in history, 2 American Rivet Joint Intelligence Gathering aircraft were recorded flying in the Gulf of California in early February 2025. This area of Mexico is controlled by the Sinaloa Cartel, and the Rivet Joint aircraft would be powerful tools in gathering local intelligence. These aircraft are amongst the deadliest in the U.S. arsenal, not because of the weapons they pack, but because of their ability to vacuum up huge amounts of intelligence. Each aircraft comes packed with all manner of highly classified signals intelligence systems that can detect, intercept, and if necessary, decode electronic signals. They can also work backward from the signal's receipt, pinpointing the exact location of the transmitting device. From there, they can track its movement in real time, following the operator as they travel throughout the country. They can also use synthetic aperture radar to track movements of distant forces, and it can do all of this up to a range of hundreds of miles. The presence of 2 Rivet Joint aircraft is the strongest indicator yet that the White House is serious about using military force against the cartels. The vast amount of intelligence these aircraft pick up will be used to track cartel operations, even down to individual leaders. With the ability to instantly relay data to American intelligence forces worldwide, each Rivet Joint becomes a gateway into the inner workings of the Sinaloa Cartel. It allows thousands of U.S. and allied intelligence operatives to analyze and map the cartel's networks, uncovering the best ways to dismantle its operations. In addition to pre-staging equipment and deploying Tier 1 special forces to lead the fight, the U.S. would also need to position conventional forces near the border. These units would be essential for launching cross-border raids and providing rapid support to ongoing operations, ensuring sustained pressure on the cartels. Again, the U.S. is already taking steps with the deployment of members of the 82nd Airborne to the southern border. Deploying combat troops in this manner sends a powerful message to both Mexico and the cartels that the White House is serious. The 82nd Airborne Division, one of the U.S. military's premier rapid response forces, would make that message unmistakable. Conventional forces would play a key role in a conflict that would be centered mostly around the use of special forces. Anytime that special forces end up biting off more than they can chew, they call for help from local conventional forces, which are usually responsible for establishing a rapid reaction force. Units like the 82nd could provide support for special operations forces via air or land insertion, rapidly deploying via helicopters or armored vehicles. Again, this is where having Mexican cooperation would be critical, as it would allow these forces to be stationed inside Mexico itself and closer to the fighting. They would also be responsible for conducting deterrence patrols in local areas in order to keep cartels from launching retaliation raids against civilians. But we'll dive into cartel tactics in just a minute. Any further deployments would depend on the nature of expected fighting. The cartels are heavily armed, but not so heavily armed as to pose a significant threat, requiring the use of things such as armored forces. The heaviest piece of equipment that cartels have been seen operating are homemade narco tanks. These are usually makeshift armored vehicles that use a truck chassis and steel plates for protection. These tanks may have smaller caliber weapons, such as machine guns, and occasionally even a small caliber cannon. But against U.S. forces armed with advanced anti-vehicle drones, the threat would be minimal. Switchblade 600s could strike with precision, while loitering air cover from Apache helicopters and AC-130 gunships to Reaper and Predator drones armed with Hellfire missiles would ensure battlefield dominance. And if brute force was needed, the vaunted A-10 Warthog would be more than up to the task. And that's right, there's already talk about how a narco war could revive the Warthog, which would soon become the premier close-air support weapon for American forces. With its extremely tough and durable airframe, it's the perfect weapon for flying low and slow against cartel forces that are increasingly armed with sophisticated equipment of their own. The A-10 may have been born to hunt Soviet tanks, but it has excelled in the close-air support role for troops fighting insurgents and terrorists. Other cheaper aircraft like the Super Tucano would also play a key role, though currently they're only being used for training. The need for cheap and persistent air support could see the U.S. buying many more of these agile aircraft. Armed with overwhelming firepower and the best surveillance and recon capabilities in the world, America's forces would make short work of the cartels inside of Mexico. Much has been made about the fearsome reputation of the cartels, but they remain largely thugs with guns. Meanwhile, the U.S. military has spent 20 years and billions of dollars honing itself to fight exactly this type of asymmetrical war. That doesn't mean that the cartels would be a pushover. There's a very good reason why previous administrations have never used military force against the cartels. While America is, in fact, at the height of its skills in waging asymmetrical warfare, the cartels pose a significant threat due to their proximity to the U.S. When fighting terrorists and insurgents, the U.S. had the security of thousands of miles of separation between them and the American homeland. In this case, only a single border separates the fighting. Mexico's cartels have proven time and again to be resourceful and innovative organizations, quickly adapting new capabilities and regularly outfoxing both Mexican and American law enforcement. After 50 years of the war on drugs, we like to remind the audience that drugs remain absolutely undefeated. And that's not just due to the insatiable demand from Americans seeking any escape from the capitalist hellscape they find themselves in. It's because of the cartel's ability to adapt. The cartels would lose any stand-up fight against U.S. forces. A smart cartel leader would be willingly sacrificing underlings in positions of power to give U.S. forces a sense of accomplishment while going underground. Cartel compounds may be famously extremely well guarded, but a single volley of Tomahawk missiles would flatten any piece of architecture the U.S. military does not want standing. The level of firepower the American military brings to this fight is simply unsurpassed, which is why cartel forces would inevitably turn to asymmetric warfare. And with the U.S. border so close, one highly vulnerable target could hand them a victory, even against the full might of the American military. At the moment, there is an estimated 100,000 or so cartel members inside of the United States, overseeing operations on this side of the border. If cartels have no hope of beating the U.S. military, then their best strategy is to instead beat the American people. Cartel forces would likely launch a massive wave of terrorism across the United States. While there would be no flashy attacks such as the September 11th attacks, cartel violence inside of America could be even more devastating than the 9/11 attacks were. For starters, cartel gunmen would go after the families of U.S. service members. Most military families live in on-base housing, where security is handled by military police. But while MPs provide protection, they are neither trained nor equipped to repel a full-scale assault like conventional infantry forces. But targeting of family members would likely take place off-base, and cartels have shown great sophistication in their ability to gather open-source intelligence. Finding out who is a military spouse or a relative of a service member would not be particularly difficult in the age of social media. Cartels would also target regular civilians, carrying out retaliatory attacks on places such as shopping centers, concerts, and other areas where large numbers of people usually gather. Next, the cartels would target American infrastructure. The organizations the U.S. would be fighting are not just well-funded, they are wealthy enough to hire the same former Special Forces operatives the U.S. relies on to hunt them. And that exposes a dirty secret the American Special Forces community doesn't like to talk about. A growing number of retirees are offering their skills to the highest bidder, including Mexican cartels, which pay a premium for their expertise. A campaign of industrial and commercial sabotage would be aimed at disrupting the daily life of millions of Americans. For example, cartel saboteurs could target your local power plant, destroying or disabling one or more of its generators. The resulting blackouts could last for days or even as much as weeks and bring about absolute chaos. We only have to look at the New York City blackouts or the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina to see just how fast civilized people become uncivilized in the absence of electricity and running water. America is completely vulnerable to these attacks, now more than ever with the rise of drone warfare. Historically, any nation or terrorist group that has attempted to wage war against the U.S. has faced a massive hurdle. They've had to transport men and equipment across thousands of miles of ocean to reach American soil. The cartels, however, are different. They would be the first enemy America has faced on its own doorstep since the Confederacy had to be reminded that owning people is both evil and uncivilized. And this is the secret of the cartels, and why, despite America's overwhelming superiority, no administration before has ever authorized military action against them. What do you think? Should the US launch a full-scale military operation against the cartels, or would that create more problems than it solves? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now go check out the United States versus the world, or click on this video instead.